Man Up, a program dedicated to inspiring and helping men live lives of heroic virtue. And now, it's time to man up.
Welcome to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. We are broadcasting on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. I am Joe Stopulus, and today I'm going to have on who has become a reoccurring guest, and for good reason, Mr. John Bishop, Dr. John Bishop, as we launch into our Heroic Marriages series. Start in prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and the snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Similar to how we launched the Heroic Fatherhood series last year, beginning or end of last year, with Dr. John Bishop. Obviously, I did a little bit of this already on kind of the first episode, but the first guest here, I kind of set the stage for why I think we need this, and now we're going to dive into it. And so over the next few months, we're going to explore marriage, the sacrament of marriage, what makes a great marriage, and we'll go into examples of couples and individuals and people on the interview on what they've experienced in their own life, what they've seen in their own life that has been beneficial to their marriages and other great marriages they've seen. And hopefully we'll see some recurring themes. I'm sure some things that work for certain couples will maybe not work for you, and some things that will. And so over the course of these months, that is the hope. And so starting today, with a guest with whom you should be familiar with now, which is Dr. John Bishop, who is the president and CEO, founder of Forge. Forge's the main theme of Forge is to reclaim the family, and he does that specifically by reclaiming fatherhood and helping men to live out this vocation of fatherhood, helping them to discover authentic masculinity. And so, in doing that, obviously, a major part of that is being good husbands, is being a good partner within the marriage. And so John has written about this extensively. He's thought about this extensively. He's also a father himself. He's within a marriage. And so he'll bring a lot to this table, especially as we set the table similar to how we did on the heroic, on the actual masculinity side of things. We're going to do that now on marriage specifically. So we did fatherhood and masculinity. We're now going to do it in marriage. And there's no one better to start this with than Dr. John Bishop. We're going to head to a short break, and we'll be right back.
My help comes from you. You're right here.
Welcome back to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. Excited today to have on reoccurring guest, Dr. John Bishop. John, welcome back to the show.
It is great to be back, Joe.
So, John, we are now entering into the idea of heroic marriages. We've done heroic fatherhood. It's done. Everyone who listens to the show is now a tremendous father, thanks to you and the work of all the other people who joined me for that series.
Check.
And now we're looking forward to marriage. I think it's interesting, what your life's work, what you've done with Forge specifically, is this idea of reclaiming the family. You're doing it through the lens of the man. And so I think you're going to help to bridge this gap of, I've spent a little time talking with the Catholic Church's vision on marriage and how we can find joy within marriage. And I'm going to spend a lot of time in the next few months interviewing married couples and hearing, what has worked for them. But what you've done in your life and with the research you've done is you've explored this and you've said, this is where I want to go. And specifically on masculinity, but I believe it is more broad than that. It is marriage through the lens of masculinity, through the man. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, and you can expound upon the state of marriage as it stands today, and then we'll get into some things and maybe how we can help that.
Yeah, Joe, thanks so much. So state of marriage today, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. And obviously there are many, many ways in which marriage is attacked today, but there are also many, many things that are so good going on with marriage. And of course, the church in the last 40, 50 years of her history has spoken into marriage more than any other time in human history. John Paul II, who I talk about so much, is probably the most prolific person in the history of Christianity on marriage. And so we're at a privileged time where, I give talks on things like theology of the body and sexuality to college students a lot. And when I do so, oftentimes I say that there was never a more exciting time to be Catholic than 2024, except for 2025, because the grace seems to be outpouring more and more. And I'd say that especially in Des Moines, Iowa, with all the wonderful things going on here, central Iowa at large. But oftentimes I think when Catholics think about marriage and the threats that are coming at contemporary marriages and families, they think of sexuality and they say, okay, gosh, our culture is so broken. Everything from the 1960s and the introduction to the contraceptive pill, all the way through to transgenderism today, and the manifold ways in between where sexuality has been disfigured by what you might call fake sex. First instance of fake sex being something like contraception, going to pornography, going to transgenderism, so on and so forth, and a lack of respect for the beautiful design that God put in sexuality. And of course, our contemporary sexual cultural milieu has done enormous harm to the family. But in these next 10 minutes here, I actually kind of want to like zoom back a little bit and talk about not only what might be termed as the sexual revolution, but also what you might call the industrial and digital revolutions as well. Because I think by virtue of discussing these three revolutions, we can get a little bit of a complete picture for the state of marriage today. Okay, so I'm going to start with the Industrial Revolution, and I'm going to begin with a conversation.
It all comes back to everything comes back to the Industrial Revolution.
Everything does.
Everything always comes back to this.
Yeah, it's like.
By the way, if you ever get a multiple choice question on a test, that's going to be the answer. Just put
Industrial
That's what it is.
That's what it is. Which is why I think if any good student of Catholic sexual teachings should also be a good student of Catholic social teachings. Things like solidarity, subsidiarity, preferential option for the four, rerum novarum, was so prophetic, the 1891 encyclical of Leo XIII, in predicting not only what's going to happen in the economy, but in what's going to happen for the family. Okay. Now, let me talk for a little bit about the Industrial Revolution and try and say concisely the effect that it has had on the family. And I'm going to introduce this topic by recounting a conversation that I had with the chief exorcist of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. So this man, extraordinary man, his name is Monsignor Charles Pope, fitting name for a priest.
He's written great books, by the way. I didn't know he was from Kansas City. But
I know Washington, D.C.
That sounds bad. I've read a book of his.
Yeah, wonderful guy. And he actually features in a recent Forge series. I was doing an interview with him, and he was talking to me about kind of his thoughts on marriage today. And he said this line that I'll never forget. He says, John, the nuclear family is indeed the building block of all society, but it's a weak building block if it's isolated. And he was actually talking about the effects, the kind of the trickle-down effects of the Industrial Revolution. When you think of the Industrial Revolution, you think of, the big changes that happened in society when, say 200 to 150 years ago, you've got a wholesale move of the brunt of the world's population from agrarian, farm-centered, family-centered villages that had been around for millennia in some cases, to cities, where people are living oftentimes lives that are disconnected from their families. The economic center of life is no longer what it used to be in a small village where, for example, many things were produced literally in the home. You might think of, for example, even if you weren't a farmer, the blacksmith shop where just like mom, dad, family are living upstairs, dad goes downstairs and does his work. And the productivity of the economy, the locus of that productivity is in the home. Everything centers around the home. Now, you introduce industrialized production, and at an ever more rapid pace, families which were living in stable farm communities across millennia are all of a sudden torn apart, right? And you have the young women and the young men from those farm families moving to big cities and living lives that were far different from the lives that their parents, their grandparents lived, and living lives that were disconnected from the communities that they grew up in. Now, fast forward to 2024, and you see the same thing, but at an even more rapid pace, right? So I left the beautiful paradise of Iowa and lived in 9 different cities from 2008 to 2023. And that was not, I mean, that's quite a bit, I suppose, but it's a lot. But it's not all that uncommon. I mean, when I lived in 2 of the places that I lived were Denver and Washington, D.C.
Well, in Denver, there's not a single person born in Denver.
Right. That's actually the story I was just going to say. Like I remember walking into any party that I walked into in either Denver or Washington, D.C., the first question out of my mouth was, "Hey, my name's John. Where are you from?" Because the presumption is that you are not from here.
By the way, I was in the mountains a few weeks ago in Denver or in Colorado, and I asked people where they're from. They said, "We're from Denver." I go, no, where are you from? Like, oh, I'm from Indiana. I'm like, yeah.
That's right.
There's two questions to this. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, and the sad part about that is when those millennial, Gen Z, before them baby boomer individuals meet their spouses in those cities, settle down in those cities, and they live in mass, suburbs, for example, disconnected from the support structures that throughout the whole history of humanity were part and parcel of familial flourishing. That's a problem, right? So to make that very clear, I remember being in Denver and just dozens and dozens of couples who were wonderful, devout Catholics that we were close friends with, who were really struggling in their family lives because they had no intimate, sustained blood relations in that town, And this is, I don't want to say that, and, anybody who's, living here in Iowa and they're like, oh gosh, well, I mean, like my family, I left them, back in Eastern Europe, or I left them, just in another part of the state, and it was kind of something that I had to do, there's really a clear reason why professionally I have to be here. Okay, I get it. But what I want to impress, at this kind of stage and in this little historical development that we're drawing is that there is a value to raising families amidst intergenerational communities. Because I don't care how much of a saint you are, if you are 25 or 35 or 45, and you've got somewhere between 1 and 75 kids at home, you are drowning in a way that none of your peers can help you with in the same way that somebody in their 60s or 70s can help you with. And the value of that intergenerational community is huge. Further, you can help people in their 60s or 70s in the way that they really need your help, okay? Sometimes I heard a wise woman say that next to contraception, the worst thing that ever happened to the family was the interstate. That the way in which it just sliced and diced families and took them all over planet Earth has really been crippling. Both in terms of the way in which it's just kept people from flourishing, period, but also the way in which it's aggregated power that should be in the hands of large families to local governments and unfortunately to federal governments as well. Used to be that you had kind of like a father, mother, and a child, and now you've got like a mother, child, and a bureaucrat. That's a
great. Well, but the way you're painting it, I would agree with this. And I think I've gone another direction with this, which is those breakdowns of those communities you talked about early on from the Industrial Revolution. You're actually like, we are meant for other people. We're meant for community. Yeah. And now I don't even need my neighbor, right? I don't need the farmer down the road because I can go to the grocery store and everything I need is there. And so there's this level of, I used to have dependence and interconnectedness with people in communities, which I don't have anymore because we're all it's totally separate from each other. We can do whatever we want. But now you set the stage on, okay, this is clearly a thing. My family's in Davenport, Kristen and I both. And so I'm literally going there in 3 days to go back for the weekend. And so we make a concerted effort. But given this is the reality, what you've said here, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean for us today? Let's say with wherever we're at in life, what does that mean for us? How can we respond to that?
I think there's a word that is said frequently in Catholic circles, that it's said frequently for a reason, because it's critically important for anyone living today. Intentionality. Okay. Joe, so your family doesn't live down the road from your house.
It's a long road. It's I-80. It's one of those interstates.
That's right.
It's 2.5 hours. But yes.
Yeah. Instead, you're stuck with other West Des Moinsians like me. And as good as I am, I'm not as good as your dad. Yeah. And that being the case, you have to have, and knowing you personally, I know that you are very intentional about building community in your life, about seeing families regularly, right? About cultivating interdependence, about mixing, your children with other children who are of like mind and who are going to be pursuing holiness as well. If you lived in, let's call it Swuseldorf in Austria in, let's just say 1652 or something like that, then you didn't have to be as intentional as you are today, right? Because you kind of just like walk out your door in the morning and you're surrounded by a lot of other Catholics who are, generally living their life the same way that other people lived their lives 700 years ago. Not the case anymore. And so intentionality is required. Now that story of the disintegration and the disfigurement of the family that began with the Industrial Revolution obviously continues in the sexual revolution today, where obviously, and this isn't, the time to talk about this, but the church teaches that sexuality, marriage, and family are a beautiful gift that are to be embraced. And the reason she has the rules that she has about them is to protect this beautiful sacred gift. Okay. I think that there's a way in which the disfigurement of today's family, everything from transgenderism to pornography to so on and so forth, really goes back to contraception. I've said it so many times, and I think even on your show before, that humanity fell in love with doing sex in a fake way in the 1960s. Okay. And that a fake, inauthentic mode of experiencing sexuality really was kind of ushered in. Maybe you could say it came in the flappers in the 20s or something like that. But really, it was kind of like brought in full force, right? When the contraceptive pill makes it so attractive to live a sexually alternative lifestyle. That confusion, which brings about rampant promiscuity, which brings about disrespect for women, which ultimately brings about the need for abortion as a backstop for a contraceptive failure. That enormous difficulty, of course, flowers into further disfigurements of sexuality, and in the manifold ways that we've talked about already. Okay, but I think that perhaps the most pressing difficulty that is contributing to not only the disfigurement of the family and sexuality, but the disintegration of the family comes in a third revolution. So we've sort of spoken about the Industrial Revolution. You might call that broad period of sexual history from 1950s, 60s to the present day, especially the 60s to the 80s, the sexual revolution. But there's another thing that you might broadly term the digital revolution. And that's that in your average household today, for the last 3 generations in particular, there have been additional members of the family. And those members are the various screens, right, that are at play in the home. And I remember talking with another wise friend about this once, and I think the analogy is so true, and it's particularly important for fathers who are geared to be protectors. Screens are Trojan horses, right? It's basically the culture's way. It's everybody who thinks quite differently about the family. It's their way to come into the very center of your home and to preach a gospel to you and to your children that will confuse them, that will separate your relationship from your kids, to take that Trojan horse and to put it at your dinner table, okay, and to infiltrate the intimacy of your home. And let's just set something as horrible as like pornography aside for a moment, and just say that, like, most children today, I'm actually pretty current on this statistic. I think your average 8-year-old in the United States today, in terms of their exposure to a screen, it's around 7 hours a day. Is about where it sits at the moment. And I say this almost like as a confession on the air. Like I'm so guilty myself. I'm opening my phone in front of me as we speak, because it's just so easy. All of the things coming at me. But setting all of the sexual things aside for a moment, the way in which, just speaking for my own family, that phones kill me is that they kill the intimacy and the bonds that I have with my wife and my children. It's difficult for me to set my iPhone aside. I'm a bit of a neurotic person, and I'm addicted to my phone, as is most of the population. And so when I find my son, my toddler, who's so enthralled with me right now, distracted, because I can't keep his attention because I'm checking a text message. Right. It's just horrible. So like my wife and I, we recently took a step where we have a box in our front closet where we put our phones for big chunks of the evenings on Sundays. And we got a landline. We'll have a talk off air about this. Keep going. Yeah. There's pros and cons. I got a political survey yesterday. It was kind of annoying. But it's kind of enabled us for very long periods of time to just kind of be available to one another. There's only like 10 people on the planet that have the number for the landline, and I figure if there's ever a real emergency. By the way, I want to implement that. I thought about doing this next time I have a party. Yeah, like outside of the fact that a lot of my parties now are about music and so people need to get the lyrics on their phone and stuff. Other than that, like I think it'd be a great thing to implement at a party. Like, the total side note, like everyone here, just say if you're gonna walk into this space, put it here. Then you have to like be a person. Yep. So all these things you're saying, and you use this word
with the fatherhood one, you've used it again here, is intentionality. And I think all of these things to me are saying there are more things at play today than there were in the past. This kind of gets to the book about From Christendom to Apostolic Mission, about
100%.
how everything used to work with us and now everything's basically working against us. And so in order to have a good marriage, in order to be doing what the Catholic Church calls us to do to live out this vocation we're being called to, now more than ever, we need to be intentional in what we're doing. And so, I use the example of screens. By the way, I'm going to hold you around for the next break and keep you on because I have some other questions. But I had this conversation a couple days ago with a friend or coworker, I can't remember who it was, but about how hard it is. Like our kids have almost zero screen time, and they're saying, "Oh man, my 3-year-old it's just so much easier." I'm like, "Yeah, there's the drug.
Problem.
There's the drug is because the world has made it very easy for you to pacify a child by giving them a screen. And so for you, I've always made the joke that being a parent is easy. That just takes two willing adults to make a child. That's actually not that hard. The hard part is being a very good parent, is being an intentional parent, is being one that actually does the hard thing that is going to lead to the better results. So I'm going to pause it there. I'm going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back. We're going to finish this episode. I feel like we should have gone 2 episodes. Maybe I'll have it back again some other time. But there's still a lot to cover in the next 3 minutes. So we're going to head short break, and we'll be right back.
My help comes from you. You're right here.
Welcome back to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. We're going to wrap up the conversation here with John Bishop as we start this Heroic Marriages series. And I think we've already found the theme again that you have given us, which is intentionality. So with that, I'll turn it over to you as we talk about having intentional marriages.
Yeah. So, Joe, I think you make a great point that being an intentional parent is so hard. But, paradoxically, I think sometimes, too, we make it hard for ourselves. I know I'm kind of taking a little bit of a different angle here. Like your point stands, times 100. I recently read a book called Family Unfriendly. Have you heard of this?
I've not, but this is why you're on the show, because you have read it. It's not surprising.
So I can't remember his first name of the author, but the last name is Carney, Carney. And the book basically makes the point that contemporary culture takes a lot of things that are really kind of like the details of family life, and by taking those details out of the hands of parents, makes parenting so much more difficult for the parents themselves. And let me give some examples. Our culture idolizes youth sports. And so to have especially a large family and your kids be involved in youth sports is like a joke. It's like how can you possibly, get to, 3 or 4 sports practices a night, And this guy, Family Unfriendly, talks about the neighborhood that he lives in and how most of the people in his neighborhood in suburbs of D.C., Northern Virginia, have kind of just made this summary decision. They're going to prioritize the intellectual development of their kids. They're going to prioritize, their ability to get a job someday, so on and so forth. But they've just decided to throw out most of the crap of contemporary culture when it comes to, the extras of life. And they've been astounded how instead of sports being something, for example, that stresses them out, where they're like basically, a living Uber service for all of their kids from sports practice to sports practice. What they do is they get together like once a week and allow their kids to play baseball, and they have drinks, enjoy one another's company. The kids learn more lessons than they otherwise would, and the parents are fulfilled as human beings. And I'd commend that book to people. It doesn't have to be as hard as our culture makes it to be, So just kind of a complimentary point to, I think, what you're saying.
It is interesting, though, like that idea of the sports thing it obviously permeates everything we do, and there's gives and takes, and you can't physically do all of it, right? It's the same thing in marriage. Like we all have a certain allotment of time with which we have to do, and so I think back to the intentionality, which again I think is a new theme.
Intentionality.
Is we have to in our marriages prioritize all these things, and obviously kids complicate. It's funny when we do marriage prep. I oftentimes so there's like your life. And then there's life after kids. And like they're going to be, it's so different. I almost feel like it needs 2 different marriage preps. Because like I'm going to give you guys marriage prep A, and then everything else is corollary B, because your time just gets,
it's totally
gone.
Different deal.
It's totally gone. So with
intentionality.
Intentionality is going to be the theme for the show. John, I'll probably need to have you back on at some point because I know you got a lot more to talk about on marriage. But thank you for joining me today on Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. I am Joe Stopulus. It's time to man up.
Man Up, inspiring men to live out their call to holiness.